So, just to orient ourselves, this is module, I have to remind myself, this is module 11 of the, in the Discovering Buddhism series. And I know that for quite a number of people here, this is the first module you're taking. In fact, could I see a show of hands for how many people it is the first? Okay, good. So here's a rundown of the first 10. Actually, what I would like to do is just place this course in the entire series, so we have an idea of where this material fits in, and don't feel nervous that you don't have the background in the previous modules. Because it's always the case that we learn in a cumulative manner. It's always a good idea to take any of these teachings over and over again, because each time we glean something from it to add to the total. And on top of that, I think it's actually rather auspicious if this is the first teaching. It's not auspicious that I'm the one who's giving it, but it's auspicious that this is the subject matter, because I had something similar happen to me when I first started receiving teachings in 1971 in India from my teacher, Geshe Ngawan Darge. An old high school friend of mine had gone over to India to study with the Tibetans, and he met Geshe Darge and had been studying with him for about a year and was writing up the teachings as he was going along. Eventually, they were published many years later. But he had the working manuscript of those teachings. And so a year later, I went over and I joined him and took the teachings from him. But when I arrived in India, it was winter time, and where the Lama was living at that time was in one of the colder areas of India. And so people pretty much left during the winter months and went to the warmer places, including Goa and some lovely beaches like that. And especially to Bodh Gaya, the site of the Buddha's enlightenment. Because as I think I've mentioned in this room before, Bodh Gaya, that's the site of the Bodhi tree under which Buddha manifested enlightenment, that Bodh Gaya is one of the very hottest places in all of India. In fact, there's a tradition that the hot hells are located right under Bodh Gaya. And hot, I mean really hot, like in excess of 130 degrees hot. Just extraordinarily hot. So really the only time to visit it is in the winter, when it's really quite nice. So we went to, I went to Bodh Gaya, then we went around South India, went to Goa, and then eventually when it was about March or so, then we headed back up to northern India, and shortly after that I joined the classes. Now this particular class was on a subject that I'll have more to say about in a minute, the Lam Rim, the stages of the path. Many of the people in this room have already heard that phrase before. I'll talk about it a little bit more in a second. And this is I still remember that I was reading the manuscript, so I would be kind of up to speed to join the class. And my friend was up to page 282. I still remember that. And it was the beginning of the section on the compassionate bodhicitta, which is the heart of the teachings that are that this module and the previous module were concerned with. And I always felt somehow that this was such a such a fortuitous, auspicious happening that the very first teachings that I received from the mouth of the Lama was on the very subject that I found most attractive in Buddhism, the development of the compassionate mind, the bodhicitta motivation, the wish to achieve enlightenment for the sake of benefiting others. So those of you who are here for the first time, if this is the first or one of the first teachings that you're receiving, then I think it's also very, very positive that even though in a sense you're starting near the end, you're also starting at the heart, the very heart of the teachings. There's a lot of things that can be gained by studying a spiritual path in general and studying Buddhism in particular. If you're into it, you can learn to levitate. You know, you can learn to walk through walls. You know, though as someone once said, the chances are that you'd actually only get halfway through the wall. You know, there's really a lot of philosophical knowledge that you can gain, and ability to sharpen the mind and debate. There's certainly techniques for developing single-pointed concentration and so forth. There's great wisdom to be gained. There's so many, many things that make up the Dharma in general and the Buddhist Dharma in particular. But none of these things matter at all if we can't use them to open our hearts to others. Then it's just dry intellectual knowledge or a power game or something like that. You know, instead of something that really gets us out of ourselves, opens us up, and makes our life meaningful, it just becomes another ego trip. So this really is, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama says on many occasions, compassion is really the heart of the Buddhist teachings. And one of the most attractive qualities, I think, from the Buddhist Dharma is that it not only extols the virtue of loving compassion, as do many other systems, but it actually provides many, many very practical techniques for transforming our present mind into the mind and the heart of compassion. I know some people have told me that they've studied other religious traditions, and they found the ideals presented in these very, very positive, very worthy. But they found it difficult to come up to the answer to the question, how do I actually develop those qualities? And the Buddhist Dharma, I think, is extremely practical in this sense, in that it provides many different techniques, including the techniques of meditation itself, to bring about this transformation of the mind or transformation of the heart. I also think, and this is just my personal view, that the other great spiritual traditions in the world have had many of the same or similar transformative techniques within them as well in the past. But it seems that the popular version of many of these religious traditions somehow or other either skip over these techniques or just simply or are unaware of them or just don't pay very much attention to them. But you'll have to see whether that's true from your own experience or not. But it seems, looking at it from a bit of a distance, that many of these traditions present modes of thought, modes of behavior that are extremely positive, extremely worthwhile, But other than the path of devotion itself, they seem to lack many of the transformative techniques to actually embody these qualities. As I said, I think many of these traditions had them at one time, but perhaps they were transmitted only within the walls of certain monasteries, for example, or only in certain traditions which may, for various historical reasons, may not have become the traditions that the major, most widespread of these traditions. And therefore these got either lost or forgotten or put in a corner somewhere. But I know that when His Holiness the Dalai Lama meets with leaders of other spiritual traditions, he often asks about what techniques they have for transforming the mind. And if the others there come from a contemplative order, they do have those. They do have techniques. It's just a question as to whether these techniques reach people in general. Okay? So anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent. Get used to it. So, I made brief mention of the Lam Rim. The Lam Rim, okay? So who's brave enough to give me a definition of the Lam Rim? Any? Who besides Jamil, who knows the answer? Yeah, he knows the answer, though. Yes, please, Midian. Okay, so Midian says that the definition of the Lam Rim is the graduated path to enlightenment. Very good answer. Specifically, Lam means path, and Rim means stages, or graded, being in stages or in a graded order. And where do these Lam Rim teachings come from? Well, let me rephrase the question. Ultimately, where do these Lam Rim teachings come from? The Buddha. Buddha Shakyamuni Buddha. Buddha Shakyamuni Buddha. Shakyamuni Buddha. This is the being who lived 2,500 years ago in India and turned the wheel of Dharma for our age. In other words, introduced the spiritual teachings which later were given the name Buddhism, or the Buddha Dharma. And he taught from the age of 35 until he passed away at the age of at the age of 80. Pardon me. He taught for those 45 years, and he gave a vast number of many different types of teachings. For example, when he lived, it was a time of great philosophical speculation in India. They often refer to it as the time of the, I think it's of the 70 schools, if I remember correctly. So philosophical speculation was very rife at that time. And so to those who were interested in philosophical thought, then Buddha gave very detailed, very specific teachings on cultivating a progressive understanding of the nature of reality, starting with a very general, rough idea, and eventually refining it until the final understanding of reality was arrived at. So that's the way he would teach to someone who is oriented in a philosophical direction. But many of the people he taught were not at all oriented that way. Many were common folk, illiterate, childlike in a sense, maybe we could say. And to those, he taught often in terms of parables and stories. For example, some of you perhaps have read some of the so-called birth stories or the Jataka tales, in which Buddha and his followers are in a certain situation, some event happens, and Buddha explains it, by telling a story about the past lives of the beings involved in that story, and then then giving a moral in the sense of which behavior is positive and leads to a good result, and which is negative and leads to a bad result, on the basis of that story and of the event that they all witnessed. So these became very, very popular tales, and have been retold now for well over 2,000 years, and sort of take the place of, of fairy tales, or Aesop's fables, or fables such as that. So he taught on the philosophical level, he taught on the level of telling fables, and everything in between. So if we happen to be fortunate enough to have a translation of Buddhist teachings, and they run into the hundreds of volumes, and not all of which have been translated yet, but if we have a collection of the Buddhist teachings, if we pick up a particular volume, we're not exactly sure what we're going to get. We could get a story, we could get a detailed philosophical explanation of something. It's not certain that what we get will be appropriate to where we are at this moment. When the Buddha gave the teachings, they were appropriate to where his audience was at that moment. But that's not obvious from the collection. The books aren't, as far as I know, the books aren't put in order in terms of the very specific subject matter of each sutra, but they're often, they have a different cataloging system. Sometimes it's simply the length of the sutra is the standard by which they're held together, as I understand it. Well, about 1,500 years after the time of Buddha, in other words, 1,000 years ago from now, from the present day, there lived an Indian master named Atisha. And Atisha had a great interest in not only learning as much as he could of the Buddhist Dharma, but incorporating it in his own experience. And to that end, he traveled around the Buddhist world of his time quite extensively, and received teachings from, it is said, 157 different gurus. But among those gurus, the one who had the most effect on his mind was one who was living in far-off Indonesia. And so there is a story that's told, I won't go into it now, of how Atisha left India, traveled for 13 months, a very dangerous voyage by sea, to reach Indonesia, and then stayed there for 12 years, receiving the teachings, especially on the subject of how to cultivate these precious bodhicitta, the compassionate attitude of wishing to benefit others. And then he, after having received and mastered these teachings, he brought them back to India. And later, when he was invited by the Tibetans to come up to Tibet and revitalize the Buddhism that had been brought to that country earlier, but which had been suppressed, then he brought the teachings, all of the teachings basically, that he had received from these 157 different gurus, and especially the teachings on this compassionate, altruistic motivation. And what he did was, he was of course very well versed in the existing discourses of the Buddha and their traditions, and what he did was he ordered them in a fashion that would be suitable for the training of any individual disciple's mind. In other words, the training starts right at the beginning, when we begin to recognize both the value and the fragility of this human form that we have to make something positive out of this life, it starts right at that point, right at the very beginning when we begin to show an interest in the spiritual path, all the way up to the end to the techniques for actually achieving enlightenment. So the name that's given to this type of teaching, the Lam Rim, the stages of the path, or the graded path to enlightenment, indicates that all of the teachings of the Buddha have been placed into this sequential order for the training of a disciple's mind. So this is, it wasn't as if there weren't anything like the Lam Rim teachings before Atisha. There were antecedents to this, but his ordering of the teachings and the way they spread and the way they had such a profound effect on Tibetan life, Tibetan culture, and of course Tibetan Buddhism, and then now in this century the effect that Tibetan Buddhism is having on the world since the Tibetans have left Tibet and taken the treasure of the Dharma to the outside world. The legacy of Atisha has been particularly powerful. Now, within the Lam Rim, the organizing principle behind these Lam Rim teachings, maybe I'll pose it as a question. See if I get see what response I get. What do you think the organizing principle of the Lam Rim is? Anyone have an idea? Yes, please.
Barriers that need to be broken down.
The barriers that need to be broken down. That's a very good answer. That's a good answer, but we can make it more specific. Right. Actually, that's a very interesting way of approaching the teachings. Not so much as to what has to be learned, but what has to be removed, what has to be overcome. This is actually an excellent approach, and it really does accord very well with a very basic insight of the Buddhist Dharma, which is that there exists within us at the present moment something pure, something clear, something which has the potential of full enlightenment, the potential of full awakening. And that the spiritual path, as I think I've repeated on a number of occasions here, the spiritual path is very largely one of removing those layers which are currently obscuring this fundamentally pure nature that we have. So yes, removing barriers is a very good approach. Okay? Anyone want to further? Yes, please.
The abilities of those to be tamed.
The abilities of those to be tamed. The abilities and kind of predispositions and scope. Yes. That's actually getting very close to the answer that I'm looking for. That the teachings are ordered according to the predisposition, the scopes, the abilities, the interests of those whose minds are to be tamed or trained by the teachings. Okay, now we're really getting very close and very specific. Would you like to take it a little further?
It's at the 3 levels of motivation.
The 3 levels of motivation, that's it. That hits it on the head. Motivation. One of the fundamental insights of the Buddha's teachings is that the actions that we engage in have effects. This is simply often simply referred to as the workings of cause and effect, or cause and result. That when we engage in any activity, well, let me amend that, any intentional activity of body, speech, and mind. So what we're excluding from here is things that we might do accidentally or without knowing. But any action that we engage in with full intention yields a result. So if so for instance, if we punch somebody in the nose, it not only has the immediate result of causing a bloody nose or a bruise on our fist, but it has a long-range effect as well. In other words, the energy that we give out, in this case, wishing to harm someone else, comes back on us. This, in very, very abbreviated form, is the law of cause and effect, or the workings of karma, as it's often called. On the other hand, if the action we do is positive, constructive, virtuous, then the result of that action is what comes back to us, like an echo, is an experience of happiness or well-being. Now, there is often a gap of time between the actions that we perform and the results that we receive. It's like an echo. If we stand at a precipice and shout, an echo will come back, but depending on how far away the other cliff is, it may take some time for us to hear it, for the echo to reach us. Well, similarly, when we engage in an action, we're creating an energy. It's like we're shouting out into the universe, and sooner or later, sometimes sooner, sometimes quite a bit later, that echo comes back in an experience of happiness and well-being on one hand, or an experience of unhappiness and suffering on the other, depending upon the nature of the action. As a parenthesis, I should say that if we perform an action, let's say if it's a negative action, a destructive action, that's the cause, the effect is suffering, it comes back to us, there is a way of avoiding the result. Okay? The result will come if we don't do anything to purify it. Okay? There are ways, however, to create counterbalancing karma, or to even remove the seeds of karma so that we don't have to receive the effects of the negative actions. But assuming that we just act in a typically unconscious fashion and create an action, then if it's positive, we receive a positive effect. If it's negative, we receive a suffering or a negative effect. Okay? So, within the action that we're performing, and this action can be a physical action, like punching the person in the nose. It can be a verbal action, like shouting at someone. I'm using kind of negative examples here. But whether it's physical or verbal, ultimately, the root action is mental. Right? Because it is from the intention of our mind that sets into motion the action that we do. So, for instance, if I just yawn, and in the act of yawning I punch somebody in the nose, that's not a negative action. Well, it's negative if I'm really careless. But if I honestly didn't know that person was there, and I'm just yawning and stretching, and I punch them in the nose, that's not creating negative karma, because there was no intention to harm. On the other hand, I could be, what's the word? I can be festering inside with a lot of hateful thoughts and never express them physically, but I'd be creating a lot of negative karma, a lot of negative mental karma, right? Because I would be cultivating these harmful thoughts. So, if we start analyzing the actions that we engage in, whether they're physical, verbal, or purely mental, we, we, we should investigate, we should ask ourselves, what aspect of that action is most responsible for the results that we experience? Either the positive results of virtuous actions or the suffering of results of non-virtuous or negative actions. What is it in the action that's most responsible for the result? Well, interestingly enough, it's not the action itself. The action itself is important. It's not that it counts for nothing. But much more significant than the action itself is the motivation behind the action. In other words, here, I'll use an example I've used before. It comes from the time of Buddha himself, and that is the example of someone giving great amounts of money, being a very expansive philanthropist, but with the motivation of, now people are going to think I'm great. In other words, with the motivation of enhancing his own reputation. Compared to that, to someone who didn't have anything to give, a poor beggar, in the case of this particular example, who had nothing to give, but saw the rich person engaged in this philanthropy and thought, how wonderful that he was able to make these great offerings, and may it bring happiness to many, many people. Okay? So here we have two actions. The rich guy is out several millions of rupees. You know, he's actually given that much away. The beggar has given nothing away. You know, not one penny. But the result, when you look at the result of the action, since the action of the rich person was solely ego-grasping, in other words, trying to promote his sense of self, maybe more exactly I should say, the self-cherishing attitude that's involved with reputation. In other words, totally tied up with selfishness. Because of that, the Buddha declared that the effects of his actions were insignificant, conceivably even negative. Whereas the beggar, who physically gave nothing, but mentally created this wish based on loving compassion for the welfare of others, reaped great rewards from it. Okay? Now, when we hear a story like that, we might think, well, is that fair or not? You know, that someone should spend all that money and get so little from it, and somebody else shouldn't spend anything and get so much from it. Well, it isn't a matter of whether it's fair or not. It's a matter of what kind of universe do we live in. And basically, it seems we live in a mentally conditioned universe. That the way our minds operate create the type of universe, the type of world that we experience. So when we act out of pure selfishness, or greed, or hatred, or jealousy, or closed-mindedness, or any of the other so-called delusions or mental afflictions, if this is the motive force behind our actions, then what we reap from those actions is nothing but continual frustration, disappointment, conflict, misery, dissatisfaction, suffering. Whereas if our mind, our heart, which in Buddhist terminology here can be thought of as synonymous, mind or heart, not only the reasoning capacities that we tend to associate with the brain, but the emotive capacities that we associate with the heart. All of these fall under the general heading of mind. If the activities of our mind, of our heart, are open, loving, compassionate, wise, and so forth, then we are conditioning our world, our universe, to reflect those qualities. Okay? Now, that's a lot to swallow, right? Especially in this materialistic age. Okay? So I'll get in just one second. I want to say now what what I've tried to remember to say at all of the on all the occasions that I'm up here speaking, and that is, don't accept any statement as true simply because someone in front of you is saying it, or even if that person is the Buddha or is quoting the Buddha. Right? Buddha himself told his disciples never to accept his teachings solely because, or simply because they had faith in him. But rather, we should chew it over, apply it to our life experience, apply it to the life experience of others, reason through it, use logical reasoning, use examples, and if we find that it accords with what we've investigated, then we can take it to heart, put it to practice. If not, then leave it aside. Okay? So in this case, if someone is sitting in front of you who was not born 2,500 years ago in India, but 60 years ago in New Jersey, happens to say that this is a mentally conditioned universe, that's not something to be accepted as true because I said it. It's also not something to be rejected as false because I said it. Okay? But it's rather something that we should that we should chew, that we should chew over. One other Western teacher is fond of saying we should put it in the pot and let it cook for a while. Okay? And then discover whether that statement holds up and is something that we can use to gain a deeper understanding of reality, or whether it doesn't really make sense to us, doesn't compute, and then put it to the side. Yes?
Yeah, sorry. My question is, going back to the how to punch somebody on the nose kind of thing. If somebody was coming at me with a knife,
Yeah.
or coming at my wife or daughter with a knife, and I had no choice but to punch that person, what would you call that? I mean, to me, that would be a positive action because I'm defending my family or defending myself. I guess it's the intention behind my action that is what you're getting at, right? My intention is to stop the attack and not necessarily inflict harm on the person with a knife, but to stop it.
Yes.
Am I making sense?
Yes, that makes perfect sense. I'll just repeat it briefly, and then you tell me if I got it. Going back to the example of punching someone in the nose, if it's the case that the person that we're striking is someone who is attacking us or our family, and our intention is that our action of striking at this person was not motivated by hatred for that person, but a wish to stop the production of harm, is that a negative action or not? Did I catch that well enough? Okay. Well, that's precisely an illustration of this point, that if our action is truly motivated by compassion, if, for example, the wish is not simply just to protect myself and my family, but also to protect this person from the creation of negative karma, of creating harm. If this is the motivation behind the action, and that's truly the motivation behind the action, then even a so-called violent action, like striking the person, for example, even though from the side of the action itself that is negative, since the motivation behind it is positive, the karma that's created is positive. Okay?
Person. I'm not thinking of that.
That's true. Right. Well, sometimes you have to tell the person just to stop for a second while you sit down and meditate. Make sure your motivation is correct, and then punch them in the nose. You know. But people aren't very cooperative. Actually, that does raise another point: is that it is in the heat of the moment. There's a lot of things that we do just instinctively. Well, our instincts can be trained. You know, right now, if someone attacks us, let's say attacks me or my family, I'm sure that my reaction to it is going to be mixed with a tremendous amount of anger and hatred and self-cherishing. Right? But for someone who is well trained, that person can react as quickly and even more effectively motivated by pure compassion. Okay? And in kind of, it's nice in a sense that this came up, because this teaching on this particular module concerns exactly that, training the mind. In other words, the thought here is that our gut reaction to things can be transformed. We can actually have a different attitude towards our experience than the ones we have now. Even in very difficult situations, when someone is being very harmful or when the universe is just ticking us off, there's a large repertoire of actions and reactions that we can have to those experiences. And at the present moment, for many of us, our reactions are limited to hatred, attachment, anger, jealousy, and the various negative, destructive emotions which only produce harm. Harm for others and harm for ourselves. But the mind is capable, the heart is capable of being trained, of being transformed. And this is the area of the teachings that we're most concerned with over these weeks. Did I see a hand? No? Oh, yes.
In this case of punching someone by accident when you're yawning, I had thought maybe that there could be some negative karma, just not so much because the intention wasn't there, but nonetheless that there is some negative karma. Am I wrong?
Just to repeat, in the case of yawning and accidentally punching someone, wouldn't there be some negative karma involved? If not much, at least some. I think you're right. There can be a very small amount involved, but probably not enough to yield a significant result. And since the intention wasn't there, this falls into an action which is described in Buddhist psychology as those actions about which there's no certainty that one will experience the result. That's how it's stated. That's how it's stated. So, in other words, there's certain actions in which there's certainty you'll experience the result, assuming you don't purify that action. Right? And then there's other actions which, well, maybe you'll experience some result, but there's nothing certain about it. This indicates it's very weak. It's very weak and quite easily overcome by a positive motivation, a positive action. Yeah. Okay. So the organizing principle behind the Lamrim teachings, as was pointed out half an hour ago, was the so-called 3 levels of motivation, because motivation is the single most important quality of an action to determine whether that action is going to bring us the happiness we want or bring us the suffering that we don't want. Okay? So what I think I'll do is I'll give an outline, a relatively brief outline of these 3 levels of motivation, and an indication of where the present teachings fit in that, and then we'll have a break. Okay. By the way, for the previous course, that was on Tibetan Buddhism in plain English. I gave a handout which was entitled The Lamrim Outline and the Discovering Buddhism Modules. In other words, to indicate where in these Lamrim, the stages, the graded stages of the path, the various modules of the Discovering Buddhism course fall. Maybe, if it's possible, I can have a show of hands of those who don't have that handout, who are new to the course or just don't have it for one reason or another, and then maybe during the break we can make copies of it, and so that could be kind of helpful for both this course and any future course you may attain. So can I just have an idea about how many people need a copy of that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Okay, I'll figure about 35. Okay, thank you. So, the 3 levels of motivation. Before we enter into a consideration of what we could call a spiritual path, then our interests are largely focused on getting what I like and getting rid of what I don't like. And that covers, it's a little bit like Ivory's soap, it covers about 99 and 44, 100% of our actions, right? And it's almost common sense, isn't it? If there's something I like, I want it. Something I don't like, I don't want it. I mean, it's not very profound, right? But the problem with living our life just on this level is that the kind of things that we like are simply, in most cases, are just simply something that please our senses, or that give a certain amount of superficial pleasure to our mind, right? So we can list the things that we like, the things that we find pleasing, and that obviously number 1 on the list is pizza, and then comes ice cream, and then the team that we're rooting for winning the Super Bowl, and then it goes down to a new paint job for our house, and it covers all this whole list of things that we find likable, and most of them, as I said, are just things that our senses find attractive, our physical senses, and our mental sense, the mind in kind of a basic understanding of our mind. So, for instance, we like beautiful and pleasing sights and sounds and smells and tastes and tactile sensations. Those are the objects of our physical senses. But we also like to have, a good reputation, wealth, possessions, and those are more like objects of the mind. They're not in and of themselves so tangible. Okay, but and then from the other side of the picture, what we don't like are things that our 5 physical senses and our mind finds unattractive. Bad smells, ugly sights, peeling paint jobs, the team that we don't like winning the Super Bowl, those kinds of things, right? So, in and of itself, there's nothing terribly wrong with, wanting what you like and not wanting what you don't like, right? But the problem is that if we live our life only on that basis, our life is empty, right? There's something within us, and I think most people, again, it's something to be investigated to see if it's true or not, but most people seem to find that simply living the life on this level leaves something to be desired. As if it always brings up the question, well then, what's the meaning of life? What's the purpose of life? Just to gather positive, pleasurable experiences and to avoid unpleasurable, is that a word? Unpleasurable experiences? Does that you know, to use language from a different spiritual tradition, does that satisfy the soul? And we can see, you know, for instance, if we investigate the life of the rich and the famous and the glamorous, that having things that are pleasurable to the senses doesn't bring ultimate satisfaction. Right? Because we know the case of people who have whatever their senses could possibly desire and yet still feel hollow. Mm-hmm. And we ourselves perhaps have had experiences like that. It doesn't mean that things that are attractive and pleasurable have no ability to cause us to have a positive, pleasurable reaction. Well, they do. That's the nature of pleasure. We wouldn't call them pleasurable if they couldn't induce a pleasurable reaction. That's clear. But does that experience itself ultimately satisfy? And again, as I've had occasion to quote on many times, the Buddha himself said, running after sensory objects of desire is like drinking salt water. Instead of quenching our thirst, it just makes us more thirsty. Okay. So, if that's the case, and I say if because we again, this is something that we have to investigate in our own experience and the experience of others, then what is it that does provide some measure of what we call lasting happiness, or well-being, or satisfaction, or fulfillment, as opposed to simply momentary pleasure, or the avoidance of momentary pain? Mm-hmm. So this is where the spiritual path comes in, when we start looking for something else. And often it's the case that people don't show great interest in following a spiritual or religious path until they've experienced a great disappointment in their life. Either they've strived very hard to achieve something, and then they achieve it and find it hollow, and therefore are looking in another direction, or they have a brush with death. Either their own, like they're involved in an accident or almost involved in an accident, or could be perhaps the death of someone close by. And it starts us taking stock on our life. We start to think, well, if I continue to live my life as I've done up to this point, am I going to die with a sense of what did it all mean? Isn't it all hollow? What was the purpose? To what end was I engaging in all of that activity if at the end result I have ultimately nothing to show for it? Okay? So, this thought of trying to find a deeper purpose in life, and trying to find a path that leads to a more lasting experience of well-being and happiness and fulfillment, this marks our interest in, it's like the dividing point, between the ordinary worldly existence and the interest in following a spiritual path. Mm-hmm. So the first level of motivation has to do with creating the causes for future happiness. In other words, we recognize that the life that we have now offers us a great opportunity to do something positive, to do something meaningful, but that this present life is fragile, is easily lost. Even if we were lived to 100 years old, you know, on the day before we were going to pass away, all those 100 years would seem as insubstantial as last night's dream. It goes by so quickly, doesn't it? This life, this short life. Even a long life is a short life. And there's no guarantee that we're going to have a long life. Many stories can be told about people who make all these great plans and they don't live to actualize any of them. Lama Zopa Rinpoche is fond of telling stories to that effect. And I remember on one occasion many years ago, he told the story of someone who died in his room, and when the people came in the room, they saw that he was preparing a meal, like there was a hamburger on the stove or something like that, you know. And Lama Zopa said, well, when he put the hamburger on the stove, he thought he was going to be alive to eat it, you know, but he wasn't. So this kind of realization, the brevity and the fragility. By the way, is that a word, fragility? Yeah. Oh, thank God. I was going to use fragileness, but that didn't sound quite right. You know, the brevity and the fragility of this life, when we start to realize it, then this becomes a spur to find something more lasting, more meaningful. And the basic activities that take place at this initial level of motivation is, first of all, to find reliable objects of refuge. In other words, find what a friend of mine likes to call a source of safe direction. In other words, a guide to which actions should be avoided because they create harm, and which actions should be followed because they create the causes for happiness. So within the Buddhist sphere, these are defined as the three jewels of refuge being the Buddha as a teacher, the Dharma, the teachings themselves, and the Sangha, the community of beings who are training their mind according to the Dharma teachings of the Buddha. So Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, which can be understood on many levels, but that's another course, then are the objects of safe direction. Mm-hmm. And the taking refuge, then, in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, the initial, let's say, not requirement. Can't think of the word. More almost the opposite of prerequisite. The what we're meant to do. I can't think of the word. That what follows from taking refuge in a safe, in a source, a reliable source like the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. The first thing that we have to do, the primary thing we have to do, is mind our karma. In other words, avoid those actions which are destructive and engage in those actions which bring positive results. In other words, discover what the law of cause and effect is and discriminate between those actions which are to be avoided and those that are to be engaged in. We'll take our break now, and then when we come back, we'll finish this discussion of the three motivations and the place that these teachings have in it. Okay? So that handout that I mentioned will be ready soon. Okay? Define soon. Quite soon. Mm-hmm. All right, so on the initial level of motivation, the scope of interest is benefiting the future. And this includes not only the remainder of this life, but from a Buddhist perspective, where the mind is understood to be continuous, then future lives as well, the lives in which the majority of our karma manifests. That's a very big chunk to accept. At least it was a huge chunk for me to accept. The continuity of consciousness or past and future lives. So again, that's not something to either accept because it comes from the Buddha, or reject because because you're hearing it from someone from New Jersey, but just to consider. So, but even this level of motivation, which manifests as avoiding negative, destructive actions and practicing those actions which are beneficial, especially as explained in the Buddhist Dharma, even this is not sufficient, because even if we were to avoid all negativity and create actions which are positive and experience positive results, the seed of suffering and dissatisfaction is still within us. It hasn't touched that seed. It hasn't eliminated that seed. And because of that, inevitably, in the future, the experiences of unwanted suffering and dissatisfaction and so forth will return. It's a little bit like having a tree that produces poisonous fruit, and you prune the tree. You cut back the branches. Well, that will help for a while. It'll definitely help, right? But it doesn't solve the problem. It's not a final solution, because sooner or later, as long as that tree is still alive, the branches and shoots and the fruit will regenerate themselves, and then we're still faced with the problem of the poisonous fruit. Okay? So, in a similar fashion, if we avoid doing negative actions and balance the negativities that we did with positive actions and so forth, even though this will temporarily create experiences of happiness and well-being, the seed or the source from which the negativity springs has not been eliminated. Okay? The trunk of the tree or the roots of the tree have not been damaged. So, at the second level of motivation, what's sometimes called the middling level of motivation, the interest is not simply to experience happiness and well-being in the future and to avoid obvious experiences of suffering, but it's to experience what is often termed liberation. Liberation. And liberation is very often referred to by one or both of its Sanskrit names. The general name for liberation in Sanskrit is moksha. Moksha, a very much more specific to this context Sanskrit word is what? You've ever heard of it? You've definitely heard of it. Nirvana. Nirvana. Right? Moksha, or specifically nirvana, is a state in which we're liberated from the very cause of suffering and dissatisfaction, to the extent in which it will not arise again. Okay? So, on this level of motivation, the teachings of wanting to break free from all ignorantly conditioned states of existence, this involves three interrelated trainings. And since some people have heard this before, I wonder who remembers what these three interrelated trainings are. Anyone? I'm going to start giving quizzes in this class. I did. Ethics, concentration, wisdom. Exactly right. Exactly right. Exactly right. For ethics, the ethics or disciplined behavior, or if you don't mind the word, morality. I know it's a word that has kind of bad press, right? It often kind of evokes images of, some New England Puritan, right? But what is really meant here in the Buddhist context, what's meant by ethics, discipline, morality, is very simply avoiding giving harm. Avoiding those actions which are harmful to others and actions which are harmful to oneself. Obviously, related to the whole, the topic of karma that was talked about before, quite clearly. But here, it's with the added motivation of not just simply wishing to experience happiness in the future, but to remove the very root cause of any suffering, to experience liberation. This ethical behavior provides a certain basic strength for our practice. Then on the basis of that strength, we can develop the second training, which is concentration. Concentration. And an image that I find helpful for myself relates to light. We have in this room ordinary incandescent lights. But that same light, when polarized, becomes a laser beam. That's what I'm told. The only difference between ordinary light and laser light is that in ordinary light, the photons are vibrating on many different planes. Whereas in a laser light, they're all polarized. In other words, they're all vibrating on the same plane. They're all kind of coordinated. And as a result of this, laser light penetrates. Ordinary light just stays on the surface. Laser light cuts through. Well, this is a very, very powerful analogy for our mind. When our mind is scattered, when it's vibrating on all different planes at once, when it's going here and there, then the most we get is a superficial understanding of things. Okay? And I've had occasion to go off on this before, but it seems like there's a lot of influences in our society these days which seem to encourage a scattered mind. You know, like commercials which change, you know, the viewpoint, change the visual image every 2 or 3 seconds, or even less. Right? That's one way of kind of generating a very scattered mind, is not to just stick on one thing. In fact, if you have a movie that sticks on one camera angle for a while, people get bored, right? Because they're kind of used to this constant change, this constant stimulation. It's taken as being exciting, right? But what it is scattering, right? So, if, however, we can take our mind like an instrument and sharpen it, then we can actually penetrate into whatever it is that we're going to place our attention upon. And what we're placing our attention on, if we are really seriously interested in experiencing liberation from the very cause of suffering, is an understanding of the nature of reality. An understanding of the nature of reality. And here we're getting at the point where the Buddhist teachings are explaining what is it, in fact, that is at the root cause of suffering. And from the Buddhist point of view, the root cause of suffering is ignorance, a misconception of the nature of reality, a misconception of who we are, in other words, a misconception of the nature of the self, the I, me, you know, who and what I am, a misconception about that, and a misconception about the nature of all other phenomena, everything else that we encounter, animate and inanimate alike. Now, this is a vast subject. In fact, it is the entire subject matter of the next module, right? I always hesitate to say anything about it because to make it somewhat clear, I always feel I have to say quite a lot about it, right? So I'm going to exercise extraordinary self-control, which amazes even me, and say nothing more about it at the moment. But we will have occasion to talk about it when we come to the final sessions of this course, as I'll explain in a moment. Okay, but all I will say is that this ignorance is not a lack of knowledge about the self or a lack of knowledge about other things. It's an ignorance which misunderstands the very nature of our existence. In other words, we're laboring under false impressions as to the nature, the nature of our very existence. I think I saw a question. Yes.
What you were talking about earlier, the ethics, the concentration. Well, those things, and then you said, following that, you said acting out of kindness, or, this is my question. Oftentimes, people are misunderstood. Like, it happens in a relationship most often. The man and the woman don't see eye to eye, and he says something and she takes it the wrong way. So when he wasn't trying, or she wasn't trying to inflict harm by saying this statement, and the other person really got hurt by it, is that, there's no bad karmic effect, right? Because he's coming from a good place. But and then following through on that, I guess they're called sociopaths, people who do things and don't know what's wrong. Something like that. People that just tear through life and just have no. Do they still have bad? Is there still negative on that?
I think everyone pretty much heard that. Yeah. These are hard questions to answer simply, because when you start unpacking them, you find out that they're very, very complex. I'll try to tackle the second half first, if I could. It might, I don't know, it might be helpful. I talked earlier about cause and effect, that we create certain actions and we experience their results. Well, the results that we experience from our action can take many, many different forms. And one form, one of the heaviest forms that it can take, is the instinct to engage in certain types of behavior. So, for instance, let's say we take killing with hatred, as an example of a very violent negative action. Well, there's many results that can come from that if one purified. Oneself can be attacked or killed. One can come down with diseases. One can live in places that are dangerous. These are all kinds of, according to the Buddhist teachings, different karmic results of that negative action. But in addition to these obvious forms of suffering, another result of that karmic action is to have the instinct to harm others again. In other words, to have a sadistic nature. Or, if the karma has a certain flavor to it, maybe to be a sociopath. In other words, to have no moral sense and just go for number one. Just go, if you like it, you do it. Doesn't matter if it involves hurting someone else. So in this case, that very activity, whether or not it's creating more negative karma, we'll put that question a little bit to the side. What it's doing, it's acting out as the result of previous negative karma in the form of our instinct. Right? Then, on top of that as well, since those actions do create harm, even though the person has no, let's say, typically hateful motive, that kind of motive that another person might have when they step back and they plan out how I'm going to hurt someone else, still it is still harmful. It's just arising from a kind of a deeper nature of that person, almost an unconscious nature of that person. So it does perpetuate negativity. And so that's why I said that kind of instinct is one of the worst results, is even worse than being harmed, because it creates more harm in the future. Now, I'm not sure that's a satisfactory answer, but maybe that's a little bit helpful. The first part, actually, now could you remind me a little bit? I've forgotten what the first part was.
You don't have the intention of harming someone and they're misconstruing. It's a misunderstanding.
Again, if the intention is truly to benefit and not to harm, and if a person has misunderstood it, then again, that's an action, you've had no intention to harm. So any harm that's experienced is really not of your creation. So
if you hurt someone and then how you feel afterwards, whether you're glad or sad that they're hurt.
that's yeah. Actually, all the elements that you're mentioning, if you study karma in detail, come up in those teachings. For instance, there is such a thing as the heaviness, the relative heaviness or lightness of karma, of an action. Right? So, for instance, if you can think of a negative action, like punching someone, hurting someone, or yelling at them and hurting their feelings. Okay, well, that the motivation behind the action determines the strength or the heaviness of that action. What kind of result you're going to get from it, but also whether we experience regret for the action afterwards also very strongly affects the heaviness or the lightness. So if we say something, like since I talk a lot, I have occasion for creating a lot of negative verbal karma without really intending. Maybe I'll tell the joke, but someone, instead of finding the joke funny, they find it kind of offensive. It hurts their feeling. Well, I didn't say the joke in order to hurt the person's feeling, but because I didn't have a particularly clear consciousness, and didn't have clairvoyance and lacked skill, what I said did hurt someone's feeling, right? But if at the end of it, as you say, if I say, well, I'm glad I hurt that person's feeling, that creates heavier negative karma. If at the end I feel, oh, I really regret it, and I actually either say I'm sorry or just have that feeling, that lightens the effect of the karma, right? So karma, if I say, good creates good and bad, bad creates bad, suffering, if I just say that, that is a basic karmic law, but there are many things that tweak it one way or the other. And these aren't fudge factors. They all come down to the fact that this is a mentally conditioned universe. And we can mentally condition our actions in many, many ways, both before the action, during the action, and even after the action. And therefore we can increase the relative heaviness or the relative lightness of that action. Okay? So now, going back to this second level, the second level of motivation, where we're interested in achieving liberation from the whole ignorantly conditioned existence to experiencing nirvana, the three trainings that we engage in at that time are like ethical self-discipline to provide the strength, the concentration to allow us to penetrate, and then finally the wisdom which can cut through all the false projections, all the filters that we create between ourselves and the way things are. Right? And, well, I said I wasn't going to say any more, but I'm a liar. What can I say? An example that I love to use, because I think so many people can relate to it, I certainly relate to it, is just simply human relations. Two people. Any two people. A question arises, are we seeing that person? That's a really, when you start to think about it, it turns out to be a very profound question. Because in many, many cases, what we're seeing is not the person. What we're seeing is an image that we've constructed and that which we've plastered onto the person. So instead of seeing the person's reality, we're seeing that person solely through the lens of our own projection. So we're not actually seeing the other person at all. Okay? So this is a case. Now, do I have to be more specific about that, or is that? I think it's kind of obvious, isn't it? I mean, it comes up in areas of racial prejudice. You see a color of skin, whether it's white or black or yellow or brown or whatever it happens to be. In your mind, there's an association. All black, brown, white, yellow people are, and then fill in the blank, right? There's an example of such a person. Therefore, this person must be, and there's your picture, right? Well, where's the person? Where's the person who was born of a mother and father, has brothers and sisters, does a job, has this kind of qualities of mind and this kind of qualities of heart and these good, good attributes and these bad attributes? Where's that person? Where's the person who wants to be happy and wants to avoid suffering just like me? That person is invisible. The only person we see is the image that we've projected. Okay? So, all suffering, according to the teachings of the Buddha, come from mistaking these projections for reality. And so wisdom is the cultivation of a penetrative state of mind which cuts through all these misconceptions, prejudices, biases, falsely, ignorantly created attitudes. And again, it's kind of like shaving, right? In shaving, you're getting rid of something. Getting rid of the stubble, right? So here, the sword of wisdom is shaving away or cutting through what is inauthentic, what is interfering with our appreciation of reality. And of all of the things that we have misconceptions about, the one whose misconceptions create the most problem are the misconceptions that we have about ourselves, about the very nature of ourselves. And again, we can, without going into great philosophical arguments about it, we can see the effect of this when we meet someone who is laboring under a particularly heavy delusion about who and what he is. Like the person who has these terrible inferiority complex or a terrible superiority complex, which is actually an inferiority complex, if you check carefully, or paranoia, or anything like that. Usually we say, well, that's okay, that person's nuts, Well, if that person's nuts because he or she is harboring a false image of his or her own reality, then, from the Buddhist point of view, we're all nuts. Maybe not as aggressively nuts, as the person in the prison for the criminally insane. But still, it's because we misconceive the very nature of ourself, that we see it in a way that it doesn't exist, that creates all of our problems. So the sword of wisdom, then, is the refined, investigative, analytic intelligence which is capable of cutting through such misconceptions. And through a concerted practice of ethical self-discipline and concentration and wisdom, it is possible to cut the very root of suffering and achieve liberation or nirvana. So those are the teachings which occupy the middle level of motivation. But even that's not enough. Okay? Even that's not enough. Sounds like enough. To be without suffering forever, without the cause of suffering. So even thoughts, not only do we not harm anyone, but even the thought of harming someone doesn't even come up in the mind. Right? We not only avoid, we not only stop stealing and taking what belongs to others, but even the thought, the covetous thought of wanting to take what belongs to others doesn't even come up. So there's no greed, there's no anger, there's no jealousy. Sounds pretty good, but it's not enough. It's not enough. Not enough. Why? Why isn't that enough? Would it be enough for you? Yes.
We're not working towards the liberation of others.
Right, because we're not alone. Right? We're not alone. His Holiness the Dalai Lama often points out, he says, there are, among the living beings that we share this planet with, there are some who very shortly after birth are rather self-sufficient. Okay? That's not the case with humans. you know? I'm 60 years old and I'm not self-sufficient. Right? It's a delayed adolescence. Right? Okay? But it's true. It's true for humans. And the more we investigate it, the more we realize that our lives and the lives of others are intimately interconnected. We're not alone. Right? And to strive for happiness or even liberation for ourselves alone leaves out everyone else. The example that's often used is if we relate to others as members of our family, loving family, not the dysfunctional families you see on TV, a loving family, right? Then if our house is on fire and we escape, we're not happy to be out on the lawn, out of that smoky and, dangerous environment. Well, I don't mean to say we're sad to be out there, but it's not enough to be out there if we know that our mother, father, sister, brother, husband and wife, children are still on fire, are still in danger. We would be motivated to figure out a way of going back in and rescuing them. Okay? Just simply because that's the nature of the bond that we have with others. Okay? So, on the third level, the highest level of motivation, we're not motivated solely by wishing to experience happiness and well-being in the future, though that's admirable. We're not solely motivated by wishing to cut the very root of suffering, though that is very important, imperative. But now our motivation has shifted to wishing to share that happiness, that liberation, that fulfillment, that well-being with others. To lead them to happiness, to freedom. Okay? And the method that's outlined on the third level of motivation is first to cultivate the precious bodhicitta motivation. Now, I've used that term in the beginning without really defining it too much. I kind of glossed over it. But the bodhicitta motivation is the wish to become enlightened. In other words, to remove from the field of our consciousness everything that is currently covering it. Ignorance, the delusions, and the accretions of our past karmic actions, everything, so that we can experience the fundamental purity of our mind, which I'd referred to earlier, this fundamental purity of the mind, to fulfill its potential, to wake up, to experience enlightenment, or Buddhahood, as it's sometimes known. Why? Because by waking up, achieving enlightenment, becoming a Buddha, we're in the best position to benefit others. Think of occasions in which you've truly been motivated to help someone else, but the way you went about it actually screwed things up. I know it's happened to me. It's probably happened to everyone. That have good intentions, the proper motivation, the real desire, but not the wisdom, not the skill, not the clarity to know what's needed. Maybe we've been too gentle with someone who needs confrontation. Maybe we've been too confrontational with someone who needs gentleness, right? Maybe we've just misunderstood how things fit together, and therefore what we did made things worse rather than make them better. In other words, we just didn't have the clear vision. We weren't fully awake. We weren't fully enlightened to what was going on in the situation. Okay? So now, when we have the motivation to benefit others, truly benefit others, we realize that the only way of doing that is to remove anything from the field of our consciousness, from our mind, from our heart, which is preventing us from acting in this spontaneous, beneficial manner. So on this third level of motivation which is the bodhicitta, the wish to become enlightened to benefit others. That's kind of the textual definition of bodhicitta, the compassionate wish to achieve enlightenment so that we can most effectively benefit others. On the basis of cultivating that bodhicitta motivation, we engage in the various actions of a bodhisattva. And a bodhisattva is a being on the path to enlightenment, a person who has this compassionate motivation. So the bodhisattva's actions are innumerable, but they can be reduced to a list of 6 so-called perfections. 6 perfections. And just to list them, they're on the list I'm going to hand out. So if you're taking notes, don't worry if I go a little too fast. You'll get it. They are, first, the perfection of generosity, then the perfection of ethical discipline. So again, going back to the second level, but taking it now not in terms of an ethical discipline which leads to simply to personal happiness or liberation, but the ethical discipline which leads to enlightenment, full enlightenment for the sake of benefiting others. The third one is sometimes called patience or forbearance, then perseverance or effort, then concentration, and then wisdom. We have to expect a certain duplication between the third level and what comes before, because it isn't as if we do something on the second level and we do something completely different on the third. It all builds. What changes, in part, is the motivation behind the action, and then the scope of the action involved. Okay? So by engaging in these 6 perfections with this compassionate bodhicitta motivation to achieve enlightenment, then it is possible, in fact, to win that enlightenment, to manifest our potentially enlightened nature. There is a subcategory of this highest level of motivation. By the way, just to give it a name, this highest level motivation is known as the Mahayana motivation. The Mahayana motivation, the great vehicle. Great in part because it leads to the great result of full enlightenment, and also great because instead of benefiting just one person, it benefits all beings. Okay? So this third level of motivation is the Mahayana, or the great vehicle motivation. But a subcategory of it is, instead of being called the Mahayana, the great vehicle, it's called the Vajrayana, or the diamond vehicle. Okay? And the difference between the regular Mahayana and this special Mahayana, the Vajrayana, is that the Vajrayana has extraordinary techniques which enable us to achieve this enlightenment rapidly. Buddha said it took him, following this gradual path, the path that I've described up to this point, it took him 3 countless eons to achieve enlightenment. And even 1 countless eon is a long time, made up of lots and lots and lots of lifetimes of practice. Right? But through the practice of the Vajrayana, all of that can be accomplished even within the space of 1 short lifetime. And there's an example that's often given among the Tibetans. Easily the most beloved figure in Tibetan history was Milarepa, a poet saint who lived also about 1,000 years ago, similar in time to Atisha. And early in his life, he actually was directly responsible, not accidentally responsible, but directly responsible for the death of quite a number of people and even a larger number of animals. So he really started about as low as one could start. But he must have had good instincts from the past, because instead of being like Atisha, who had 157 gurus, he only had 2. And of the 2, really only 1. He only received relatively few teachings from the first, and the vast majority of his training was under the second, Marpa, known as Marpa the translator. And Marpa put him through hell. That was his preparation. Then after putting him through hell for 6 years, he gave him his heart teachings, and after another 6 years of practice in the high Himalayan mountains, Milarepa achieved enlightenment. Full enlightenment. He didn't just become a nice guy. He became a Buddha. Right? And then he spent the rest of his life spontaneously giving teachings to others. And fortunately, we have these teachings. Many of them were in the form of spontaneous songs, which Tibetans still sing after 1,000 years. Okay? So this indicates that by following this Vajrayana path, even a murderer can achieve enlightenment within a short space of time. Okay? So this is the overall scope of the Lamrim, the 3 levels of motivation. Now, one of the special characteristics of Atisha's Dharma, of Atisha's teachings, that he received from his gurus, and especially the guru who resided in Indonesia, and 1 or 2 other very special gurus that he had. One of the special characteristics of his teachings was the ability to cultivate this precious bodhicitta. In other words, the motive on the highest, the 3rd and the highest level of practice, was to be able to cultivate this bodhicitta in all sorts of circumstances. Another way of putting it is he had these extraordinary techniques for transforming harmful, painful, suffering conditions into the path of the bodhicitta, into the development of the bodhicitta. In a word, these teachings have the ability to transform the mind, or to train the mind. Now, all of the Buddhist teachings involve training the mind or transforming the mind. All of them do. Okay? But these teachings especially have to do with the taming, the transforming, I forget whether I said taming or training, but both of them. The taming, the training, and the transforming of the mind from our ordinary selfish concern to this open-hearted concern for the welfare of others. And without that, the bodhicitta cannot be developed and cannot be expanded. So within the whole scope of Atisha's teaching, the kind of the pièce de résistance, the kind of the special crème de la crème, were these teachings of how to develop the bodhicitta, how to transform negative situations into positive situations, or, how to deal with problems most effectively, to make them, instead of something that interferes with our spiritual path, turns them into the fuel of the spiritual path. So this block of teachings, this special quality, is known in Tibetan as Lojong, L-O-J-O-N-G. I've got this board here, but you'll notice I haven't used it. But as I said, a lot of these items are in the handout that you'll receive. So the Lojong, and Lojong simply means training the mind, training of the mind or transformation of the mind. Lo means mind, and Jong has this meaning of training or transforming. So the Lojong teachings are the special bodhicitta teachings which derive from Atisha. It doesn't mean that Buddha didn't teach them, and only Atisha did. It means that his lineage specially emphasized these transformative techniques. And that is the main topic that we'll be discussing in the remainder of this course. And the text that we'll be following is known as the 8-verse training of the mind. The 8-verse training of the mind. And I think everyone who's kind of officially part of the course has received handout like that. Okay? So in it, there is this text, the 8-verse training of the mind, with a very brief commentary by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Okay? But this is not the only commentary by His Holiness or other great lamas on this. So if you wish to read more than's contained merely in this handout, I just want to mention one or two things and then we'll bring this evening to a close. There's a book that came out many years ago called Kindness, Clarity, and Insight, which has, again, an essay on a teaching, I should say, because he gave it originally as an oral teaching, a teaching on these 8 verses. Also, for those people who attended the last course in which we used the mantra Om Mani Padme Hum, the mantra of the Buddha of Compassion, which I'll also introduce in this course, he also has, among the teachings in this book, is an explanation of that mantra as well. So, that's one form. Another text, this is His Holiness the Dalai Lama. This is called Kindness, Clarity, and Insight. Kindness, Clarity, and Insight. Okay. The other book, also by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, is called Transforming the Mind. Transforming the Mind. And this is also one of the recommended readings for this course, though it's not in this handout, of course. This handout only has shorter pieces. This, again, is a more extensive commentary on the 8 verses and related material. Okay? Very highly recommended. In fact, if you don't come to the rest of the course and just read this book, you'd probably be better off. Yeah, it's called Transforming the Mind, and the subtitle is Teachings on Generating Compassion.
Is that wisdom?
This one is not wisdom. This is Thorson's. Thorson's. But I'm sure this is in the bookstore. No? We're not so sure it's in the bookstore. Okay. Okay. It's in the library, okay? Also, and this is fantastic. A friend of mine who lives in England, who runs an archival company, preserving Tibetan culture, many years ago gave me this box set, 4 videotapes. And I put it up on my shelf and never touched them after that. But then, when I was thinking about this course, I thought, well, I better take a look at that, because it's called Lojong, right? Training of the Mind. And it turns out these are the teachings on which this book is based, right? So you not only can read the book, but you can actually see the Buddha of Compassion giving the teachings. You know, they couldn't be more authentic. Maybe next there'll be bubblegum cards. But at least for now we have the book and the videos. Bubblegum cards, they come later. Okay? Oh yeah. Let's see. So it's called Lojong, or Transforming the Mind. Same title as the book. And it comes from Mystic Fire. And again, this is something that you can find on the internet. If it's not in the bookstore, you can find it in the internet, or it can be ordered. And then you have His Holiness on your TV. Okay? Then in addition, there's other, you'll see in the packet that's handed out to you, other recommended teachings, which you'll see where you can get those teachings from. But at the very minimum, you should read what's in the packet that's been handed out. These are 3 relatively short essays all on Lojong. And the first one by the Dalai Lama is specifically on these 8 verses. When it says verses, it means 4-line stanzas. There's 8 4-line stanzas on this teaching. And that will be the main text, kind of the root text of this course will be that. So as much background as you can get beforehand, I think then the more you'll get out of the class itself.
Track while you have the subject of His Holiness. Just found out yesterday that San Jose is preparing for his arrival in April. Is that something?
San Jose.
Yeah, center. On the week of 14th, I just found out. You don't know anything about that at all?
Is anybody aware of that? The Dalai Lama coming in April to San Jose? I'm not aware of that. It could, yeah, it could be, you know, just at a university or something, maybe not a public thing.
The week of April 14th, they'll be closed for preparation of his arrival. So I just heard that yesterday, so I'm just asking if that would be...
I would suggest going, again, if you have the internet, to go onto a site like Tibet House or something where they give the Dalai Lama's itinerary. What I do know he's giving is he's going to be giving teachings in Arizona in September, October, something like that. September, mid-September. That he's giving. Though I don't know if that's already booked. It may be. It's all sold out already. Yeah. Okay. But, you know, one of the nice things about living in California is that teachers like His Holiness come through. You know, there was a period of 4 or maybe 5 consecutive years, every summer, he visited. Sometimes in the north, sometimes in the south. Yeah, so, and many other extraordinary lamas as well. Now, I made a promise to someone here who emailed the office and said, please ask John to stop on time. So, I consider being 5 minutes late to be actually early. So I'm very proud of myself, and I'm very proud of you. It's very nice to meet all of you, and I hope